A man came down from the mountain that night, but he wasn't just bringing furs. He was bringing a reckoning. Snow fell on a town that was already dead silent. Not the peaceful quiet of a settlement tucked in for the night, but the heavy, waiting silence of a place holding its breath. The mountains were black shoulders hunched against a starless sky, and from their throat came Elias Boone. His boots sank into the powder without a sound, his figure so large it seemed to block out what little light there was. He smelled of pine and cold iron, a man who had spent a month talking only to the wind and the wolves. The silence didn't feel right. He was used to the quiet of the high country, but this was different. This was the quiet of a graveyard. No music bled from the saloon doors. No dogs barked a warning. It was as if the whole town had packed up and left, abandoning their homes to the ghost of winter. He moved past the shuttered mercantile, his rifle a familiar weight on his back. Then he cut behind the livery stable, the place where the sweet smell of hay should have hung in the air. Instead, there was only the sharp, sterile scent of frost. And that's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a tiny, brittle scraping, like a mouse gnawing on a dry bone. It was followed by a cough, so small and stifled it was almost stolen by the wind. Elias froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He was a man who lived by his senses, and his senses were screaming that something was wrong. He eased around the corner of the stable, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. What he saw stopped his heart cold. Two children, huddled in the snow beside a frozen trash barrel, their shapes small and desperate. The boy had a bone in his hand, picked clean and white. The girl was licking a tin plate, her tongue chasing the memory of a meal. They were shadows, ghosts in the making, and the sight of them sent a spike of ice through Elias's gut. The boy saw him first. He shot to his feet like a cornered animal, pulling his sister behind him. His face was a mess of dirt and fierce pride. "Stay back," he hissed, his voice a tiny cracking whip. Elias didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched them, his own breath pluming in the air like smoke. He was a giant of a man, clad in wolf fur, and he knew he looked like the very monster from their nightmares. So he did the one thing he could. He knelt. He sank down onto one knee, making himself smaller, less of a threat. He let his heavy fur coat fall open, a gesture of peace. "Not another night like this," he said, his voice a low rumble, more like the sound of shifting stone than a human voice. The girl June peeked out from behind her brother's arm. Her eyes were huge and dark in her pale, thin face. Snowflakes had caught in her tangled hair like tiny frozen stars. "I ain't going with you," the boy Lyle spat out. His lips were turning blue, but his eyes burned with a fire that hadn't surrendered yet. Elias looked from the boy's defiant face to the girl's shivering frame. He knew pride, and he knew hunger, and he knew that one of them always won in the end. He reached into his coat, slow and deliberate, and pulled out the heel of a loaf of bread. It was hard as a rock, but it was food. He broke it in two, the snap echoing in the stillness. He held one half out to the girl. Her brother watched, his small jaw tight. He was fighting a war inside himself, a war between his duty to protect his sister and his fear of the stranger. But when June's small, chapped hand reached out for the bread, the fight went out of him. His shoulders slumped. Elias saw the moment the boy's will broke, like ice cracking under a heavy boot. "Come on," Elias said, his voice an order now, not an offer. He stood up, a mountain of a man eclipsing the moon. "Get up, both of you." They followed him, not because they trusted him, but because the cold and the hunger had left them no other choice. He led them through the silent streets, their small feet stumbling in his deep tracks. He stopped at the last cabin on the edge of town, a crooked little box that looked like it was leaning away from the wind. He knocked once, a single solid rap of his knuckles against the weathered wood. A shadow moved inside. The door creaked open a few inches. A woman stood there, her face framed by the weak lamplight. Martha Ray Callahan. Her hair was in a long, dark braid, her cheeks red from the cold. She was wearing a man's coat, cinched tight around her waist. Her eyes found Elias, and then they dropped to the two children huddled behind his legs. She saw the breadcrumbs on their lips, the guilt on their faces. A sound escaped her, a tiny broken thing. "Oh, Lord," she whispered. Found them behind the livery, Elias said, his voice flat. Eating trash. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. Her face, already pale, went white with shame. You had no right, she started, her voice trembling. They'd have been frozen by morning. He cut her off. His words were not cruel, just a simple, brutal statement of fact. She flinched as if he'd struck her. For a long moment, she just stood there, a war raging in her eyes. Then she stepped back, pulling the door open wide. She let them in. The cabin was almost as cold inside as it was out. A tiny fire struggled in the stove, giving off more smoke than heat. There was a single chair, a lopsided table, and a thin mattress on the floor. It wasn't a home, it was a holding cell against the winter. You shouldn't have, Martha said, her back to him. She busied herself at the stove, her movements jerky and angry. You'd rather I left them? Elias asked. The silence that followed was her answer. We're fine, she finally muttered, the words a lie so thin it was transparent. He didn't argue. He just walked to the table and dropped a heavy burlap sack onto it. The thud made her jump. Inside was a haunch of venison, a slab of lard, and a bag of dried beans. Her hand stilled. I didn't ask for your charity, she said, her voice tight with pride. You didn't have to, he replied. She turned then, and he saw the glint of tears in her eyes. Gratitude and shame were fighting for control of her face. Say thank you, she whispered to the children, her voice thick. The boy Lyle mumbled something into his chest, but the girl June looked up at the giant in the doorway and whispered, Thank you, mister. Elias gave a short, sharp nod. Then he turned and walked out, disappearing back into the snow as silently as he had come. He left behind the scent of pine, the promise of a hot meal, and a question that hung in the cold air. Who was this man, and why did he care? Martha barred the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the food on the table, then at her children, who were staring at the meat with a kind of desperate awe. This wasn't just a meal. It was a reprieve. It was a secret, and she had a terrible feeling that this secret was going to cost her more than just her pride. The next morning, the town woke up, and the whispers started. News in a place this small travels faster than a winter wind. By noon, the story was all over the mercantile. Pearl Dunley was holding court by the pickle barrel, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. A crying shame, she declared, pressing a hand to her chest. That Martha Callahan, letting her children run wild like stray dogs, and that man, that Elias Boone, comes down from his mountain reeking of godlessness and starts meddling. She leaned in closer to her audience of gossiping wives. I heard he just took them, forced his way into her home. Martha was 2 aisles over, trying to trade a bit of the venison for some cornmeal. Every word was a lash against her skin. She kept her head down, her face burning. When she finally left the store, clutching her small bag, she saw him. Elias was across the street talking to Sheriff Amos Pike. He was a stone wall of a man, impassive and unmoving, but his eyes found hers. He didn't smile. He didn't even nod. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, until she hurried away. That night she expected nothing. She was a widow with a dead husband's debts, a pariah in her own town. But the next morning, when she went to the woodpile, she found a stack of freshly split firewood. The morning after that, a smoked ham. And the morning after that, a pair of sturdy, worn boots that fit Lyle perfectly. Each gift was a fresh wave of shame and confusion. Who was this man? Why was he doing this? It felt like he was laying siege to her pride, breaking down her defenses one silent offering at a time. She wanted to be angry, to throw the food back into the snow. But then she'd see June's cheeks, a little less pale, or hear Lyle laugh, a sound she hadn't heard in months, and her resolve would crumble. One morning she found something different nestled beside the woodpile. It wasn't food or clothing. It was a small wooden carving of a wolf, whittled with incredible skill, its head thrown back in a silent howl. She knew Elias hadn't left it. It was from Lyle. Her son had been spending his nights by the weak firelight, carving with the small knife his father had left him. You stop bothering that man, she told him, her voice sharper than she intended. I ain't bothering him, Lyle shot back, his young face set in a stubborn frown. I just, I want him to know we ain't beggars." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her own son, echoing the pride that was causing her so much pain. She let him keep the carving. She even found herself looking for Elias, catching glimpses of him on the edge of town, a silent guardian she didn't understand. Once, near dusk, she saw him leaving a sack by her door. Their eyes met across the snowy yard. He froze like a wild animal caught in a hunter's gaze. "You don't have to do this," she called out, her voice thin in the cold air. His breath was a cloud of white. "I know," was all he said. And then he was gone. But that night, as Martha lay awake, listening to the house groan, she realized something that frightened her. She was no longer listening for the sound of the wind or the creak of the rafters. She was listening for the sound of a giant's boots in the snow. A few days later, Lyle left another carving. This time it was a stag, its antlers like the twisted branches of a dead tree. Elias found it the next morning. He picked it up, his large, calloused fingers tracing the lines of the wood. He didn't smile. His expression was grim, almost troubled. He looked from the carving to Martha's cabin, a dark question in his eyes. He knew what the boy was doing. He was leaving payment. But there was something else about the carving, something in the way the antlers were shaped that stirred a dark memory in the back of his mind. He tucked the small stag into his pocket and turned his back on the town. As he walked away, Sheriff Amos Pike stepped out from the blacksmith shop. He watched Elias go, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The sheriff wasn't just watching a mountain man. He was watching a suspect, because the sheriff knew something the rest of the town didn't. Martha Callahan's husband hadn't just died from a falling tree. His body had been found with another man's, a man nobody could identify, and that man had been shot. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise on the last day of January. The wind woke up and started to scream. When Martha opened her door that morning, the snow was already ankle-deep and flying sideways. This wasn't just a storm. This was a monster come to swallow the world. She slammed the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin felt fragile, like a bird's nest in the path of a hurricane. The children were huddled by the stove, their faces pale. "Is it going to be bad?" June whispered, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. Martha forced a smile. "We'll be fine." It was the same lie her husband had told her, right before he'd walked into the woods and never come back. She stared out the small, frosted window, toward the tree line where Elias Boone lived. He was up there, somewhere in that roaring white chaos. And for the first time since she'd become a widow, Martha Callahan started to pray, not to God, but to the giant on the mountain. By noon, the world outside had vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a swirling, screaming vortex of white. The wind hit the small cabin in great shuddering gusts, and the roof groaned under the impossible weight of the snow. Lyle kept bringing in wood from the lean-to, each trip a small, desperate battle against the storm. June sat on the floor, her rag doll clutched in her hands, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored Martha's own. Every time the roof groaned, Martha's blood ran cold. She remembered the sound the tree had made when it fell on her husband, a dull, final thud. The sound of a life being erased. She couldn't lose them too. She couldn't let winter take everything from her. Driven by a fear that was colder than the storm itself, she pulled on her husband's old coat, wrapped a shawl around her head, and threw open the door. The wind tore the breath from her lungs. The snow was a physical force, hitting her face like 1,000 tiny needles. She cupped her hands around her mouth and screamed his name. "Elias!" The wind snatched the word and ripped it to shreds. It was a hopeless gesture, a prayer thrown into the teeth of a blizzard. But some small, desperate part of her believed he might hear it, that the giant on the mountain would feel her terror like a beacon in the storm. She stumbled back inside, defeated, and barred the door. Night fell, but the darkness brought no relief. The storm only grew stronger, its rage more personal. The cabin shook as if in the grip of some furious beast. June was whimpering in her sleep. Martha held her close, listening to the symphony of destruction outside, her own hope dwindling with every passing hour. She was alone. They were going to die here. And then she heard it. Over the shriek of the wind, there was another sound, a steady rhythmic crunch, the sound of boots, heavy boots, moving through deep snow. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. No man could be out in this. A moment later, a shadow fell across the door, so large it blocked out the storm. The door rattled, then swung inward. Elias Boone stood there, a creature born of snow and iron. His beard was caked in ice, his eyes burned like embers in the firelight. He stamped the snow from his boots and stepped inside, bringing the cold with him. "Pack what you need," he said. His voice was calm, but it held the authority of a general on a battlefield. "The roof won't hold." Pride, that old stubborn enemy, reared its head one last time. "We'll be fine," Martha said, her voice shaking. He didn't argue. His gaze went from her face to the trembling rafters, and then back to her. "You want to bet their lives on that?" The question hung in the air, sharp and deadly as an icicle. And just like that, her pride shattered. Lyle was already scrambling to gather the few precious things they owned. His carvings, his father's knife. June sat up, clutching her doll, her terrified eyes fixed on her mother. Martha knew she had no choice. She wrapped the children in their threadbare quilts and followed Elias out into the storm. It was like stepping into another world, a world of pure, violent chaos. But Elias was an anchor in the madness. He lifted June into one arm as if she weighed nothing, his other hand gripping Martha's elbow, guiding her through the swirling drifts. He was a wall against the wind, a furnace of warmth in the frozen hellscape. He led them up, toward the tree line, into the teeth of the storm. They were heading for his home, for the mountain's heart. And Martha had the sickening feeling that she was not running from the storm, but into the eye of an even greater one. Elias's cabin was built into the side of the mountain, a squat, solid fortress of logs and stone. It looked less like it was built and more like it had grown there, a natural part of the landscape. Inside, it was a different world. A massive fire roared in a stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the walls. The air was thick with the rich, smoky smell of venison stew. Furs were piled on a large, sturdy bed, and tools hung in neat, orderly rows. It was a place of solitude, of survival, of quiet strength. The children, speechless with awe, huddled near the fire, soaking in the heat. Elias ladled steaming broth into tin mugs and handed them to the children without a word. He moved with a purpose and a grace that seemed at odds with his immense size. Martha stood by the door, dripping melted snow onto the floor, feeling like an intruder. "You shouldn't have risked yourself," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at her. He was busy stoking the fire. "Didn't figure you'd want to be dug out come spring," he said, his words blunt and practical. The bluntness stung, but then June laughed. A real happy laugh, as she held her hands out to the flames. The sound was so unexpected, so precious, that it cracked something open inside Martha's chest. That night they slept on a bed of furs near the hearth. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin it was safe and warm. The children fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the fear and the cold. But Martha lay awake, staring at the glowing embers. She could feel Elias's presence on the other side of the room, a silent, powerful weight in the darkness. "You ever get lonely up here?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. There was a long silence filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. She thought he wasn't going to answer. Then his voice came out of the darkness, low and rough. "Used to. Now I just get quiet." She turned, trying to make out his shape in the dim light. "My husband," she began, the words tumbling out now, words she hadn't spoken to anyone. "He always said we'd be fine, no matter what. Then that tree fell." She took a shaky breath. "He left me with debts I can't pay. The whole town whispers. They say I'm cursed. That trouble follows me." Elias stirred. He sat up, and his shadow leaped up the wall, huge and intimidating. "Folks whisper because they like the sound of their own voices," he said. The simple, dismissive way he said it made her let out a short, broken laugh. "Easy for you to say. You don't have to face them." "I don't face them because I don't need to," he said, and his voice had a new edge to it, something hard and cold. "I lost my brother to a blizzard, years back. Up on this mountain. The town said it was our fault. Said we were fools for wintering so high. Not a single one of them came looking for him. Not until the spring thaw. He paused, and the silence was heavy with old pain. That was the last time I cared about the opinions of small men. Their eyes met across the flickering firelight. In his gaze, she saw not pity, but understanding. She saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. She nodded just once and lay back down, a strange sense of comfort settling over her. She had stumbled into the den of a bear, but for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Morning came, pale and silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world remade in white. The snow was piled in massive drifts, glittering under a sky that was a brilliant, painful blue. It was beautiful and deadly, and as Martha watched her children playing in the snow outside the cabin, she felt a sliver of peace. But peace, she was learning, was a fragile thing. Around noon, there was a sharp rap on the cabin door. Elias opened it to find Sheriff Amos Pike. His horse was breathing hard, its coat steaming in the cold. The sheriff's face was grim. "Town's been talking, Elias," he said, not even trying to be gentle. "Pearl Dunley's got the council all stirred up. They're talking about sending the children to the orphanage over in Bridger's Gap." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. Her legs went weak. Lyle immediately moved to her side, his small face a mask of fury. "They can't," Martha whispered, the words catching in her throat. "They can try," the sheriff said, his eyes filled with something that looked like pity. "She's claiming you're an unfit mother, that you can't provide. Meetings tonight." Elias shut the door, his own face a mask of stone. Martha sank onto a bench, her world collapsing around her. "I can't fight them," she choked out, burying her face in her hands. "I can't lose my children." Ilias crossed the room in 2 long strides. He knelt in front of her, his presence filling her entire vision. "Then don't fight them alone." She looked up, startled by the raw intensity in his voice. He stood, pulling on his heavy coat, every movement filled with a cold, deliberate purpose. He was no longer just a quiet mountain man. He was a warrior preparing for battle. "We ride down at dusk," he said. And when Martha looked at the set of his jaw, at the blizzard brewing in his eyes, she didn't argue. She just nodded, because she knew deep in her bones that the real storm was just beginning. As the sun began to bleed across the snow-covered peaks, Elias saddled his horse. It was a big, powerful bay that watched him with intelligent eyes. He lifted June into the saddle, her small form almost lost in the massive leather seat. Then he swung up behind her, his presence a shield around her. He had another horse, a smaller mare, for Martha and Lyle. As they rode down the mountain, the cold air bit at their faces, but a strange fire was burning in Martha's chest. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was defiance. By the time they reached the town, the meeting hall was already full. A crowd of people stood outside, their faces pale in the lantern light, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. Pearl Dunley stood at the front of the steps, her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant look on her face. "Well, well," she said as they dismounted. "Look what the storm dragged in." Elias didn't even look at her. He strode past her as if she were a piece of furniture, the children and Martha following in his wake. The air inside the hall was thick with smoke and judgment. The town council, 5 grim-faced men, sat behind a long table at the front. The chairman, a portly man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Callahan," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "it has been brought to our attention." "She ain't unfit," Elias's voice boomed through the room, silencing Henderson instantly. The sound was like a rock slide, raw and powerful. "She's a good mother, doing the best she can in a town that would rather gossip than help." A murmur went through the crowd. "Now see here, Boone," one of the councilmen started, puffing out his chest. "You have no say in this." Elias took one step forward, and the man shrank back in his chair. "Martha Ray Callahan doesn't need your pity," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. His eyes swept over the council, then the crowd. "She needs a chance, and if you think you're taking her children, you'll have to go through me first." The threat was not subtle. It hung in the air, heavy and real. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the stove. Then Sheriff Pike, who had been standing silently at the back of the room, spoke up. "The law is clear, Henderson. The council can't remove children if there's a proper household willing to claim them. All eyes turned to the sheriff, then back to Elias. A proper household, a husband. Elias turned then and looked at Martha. And in that moment, the crowded room, the judgmental faces, the entire world seemed to fall away. There was only the two of them, standing in a sea of hostility. "You can stay on that mountain," he said, his voice so quiet only she could hear it. "My cabin is strong. There's food. There's warmth." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But you won't be alone. Not if you'll have me." The breath caught in her throat. Tears pricked at her eyes. This wasn't a proposal of love or passion. It was an offer of alliance, of survival, a fortress against the world. She thought of the cold, hungry nights. She thought of the whispers and the shame. She thought of the sound of his boots in the snow, a sound that had meant hope when she had none left. And she nodded. Once. Fiercely. Ilyas reached out and took her hand. His grip was strong and sure, a silent promise. They stood together, a united front, and faced the council. The sight of them, the mountain man and the widow, hand in hand, seemed to drain the fight out of the room. Papers were grudgingly signed. The meeting was adjourned. Pearl Dunley stormed out, her face a thundercloud of fury. As they rode back up the mountain under a canopy of brilliant cold stars, with June asleep against Elias's chest and Lyle held tight in front of her, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in a year. She felt light. But the story doesn't end there. Because what happened in that meeting hall wasn't just about saving a family, it was about exposing a lie. The next day, Sheriff Pike rode up to the cabin alone. He wasn't there for a social call. "Elias," he said, his voice serious, "I need to ask you some questions about your brother." Elias's face hardened. "What about him?" "Martha's husband, Jed," the sheriff said, choosing his words carefully. "The day he died. He wasn't alone. We found another body near him. Never could identify it." He looked straight at Elias. "But he was a big man, like you, and he'd been shot." Elias stood there silent as the mountain around them. Martha, who had been listening from the doorway, felt a cold dread creep up her spine. The sheriff continued. "Pearl Dunley's husband, Silas, was the one who found them. He's also the one Jed Callahan owed the most money to. Money Jed claimed he was about to get his hands on. And then, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Not for the adults, but for the boy." Lyle, who had been quietly whittling by the fire, stood up. He walked over to the sheriff and held out his latest carving. It wasn't a wolf or a stag, it was a man with a rifle, standing over another man lying in the snow. And the man with the rifle had the cruel, pinched face of Silas Dunley. "I saw him," Lyle whispered, his voice trembling but clear. "The day my pa died. I followed him into the woods. I saw Mr. Dunley. He was arguing with my pa and another man. There was a gunshot. And then Mr. Dunley pushed the tree. The confession, delivered in a child's quiet voice, exploded in the small cabin. Jed Callahan and Elias's brother hadn't been killed in an accident. They had been murdered. Murdered by Silas Dunley, who wanted to steal whatever they had found in the mountains. A gold claim, a hidden stash, something worth killing for. The silence that followed was absolute. Elias looked at the carving, then at Lyle, and a lifetime of grief and unanswered questions hardened his face into a mask of cold fury. The sheriff looked at the boy, at the raw truth in his eyes, and he knew. He finally had his witness. Justice, it turned out, hadn't come down from the mountain with Elias. It had been there all along, hiding in the memories of a small, frightened boy. That night, Silas Dunley was arrested. Pearl's vicious campaign to ruin Martha wasn't just about spite. It was about getting rid of the only witnesses to her husband's crime. The town that had been so quick to judge Martha now turned on the Dunleys with a new, righteous fury. Their reign of whispers and influence was over, burned to the ground by a truth that had been buried under the snow. Back in the cabin with the fire burning bright, a new kind of quiet settled over them. It wasn't the quiet of loneliness or survival. It was the quiet of peace, of a future. Martha stood at the window, watching the moonlight turn the snow to silver. Elias came to stand beside her. For a long time, they just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the silent, sleeping world. Not another night like this, he said, his voice a low rumble. But the words were different now. They weren't just a promise to fend off hunger or cold. They were a vow to build something new, something warm, something safe. Martha turned to him, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she smiled. A real smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Outside, the mountain stood guard, its secrets finally told. The storm was over, and inside the small cabin, two broken hearts and two brave children were finally beginning to heal. If you believe that courage can be found in the most unexpected places and that a little bit of kindness can change the world, then do us a favor. Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us that even in the coldest winters, hope can burn bright.